Don't let politicians have all the fun. Each month, the North American Debate Circuit is running an online, highly competitive tournament at a low cost for everyone to join. Next month, we have the Garnet Cup on January 21st. If it's your first time, send us the code YouTube and we'll take 25% off your entry fees. Hope you enjoy the round.
We negate the resolution. Resolve: the United States strategy of great power competition produces more benefits than harms. We define great power competition, or GPC, as an ideological and geopolitical struggle for global influence by superpowers like China and Russia. Our sole contention is a bad strategy. There are three reasons why the current great power competition strategy is detrimental to the world. First is military spending. U.S. social spending programs aren't doing so hot right now. Lewis 18 finds the U.S. spends too little on social spending programs, exacerbating poverty and deepening the wealth gap, as Kogan 16 furthers that funding for housing, health, and social service block grants has fallen significantly over time. This fallen funding is because GPC trades off funding from social programs to military spending. GPC inherently requires a large increase in military spending to compete with other nations. However, with pockets already overstretched, funds must be siphoned from other sectors. Bugos 22 states that since GPC has started, Biden signed a $29 billion spending increase towards the U.S. military, and Wing 22 finds that military spending has crowded health funds for years now. The impact is poverty. World Bank 18 quantifies that 15 million people escaped extreme poverty via social spending programs the government funded. Without these social programs, people in poverty will be left without food, money, and a roof over their head. Second is economic warfare. Jones 22 states that winning the economic sector in GPC is more important than ever. This is because the U.S. economy heavily relies on importing and exporting goods globally. Logren and 20 furthers, the U.S. is now using economic warfare in order to win the GPC in the economic sector. Thus, conflicts in the status quo revolve around who can claim dominance economically. There are two sectors of the economy that GPC has affected, and the first is sanctions. Brand 17 finds that China and Russia are both striving towards a more economic route in order to gain global dominance, such as the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, a national road to globally support good transports. In response, the U.S. is pulling out of many economically beneficial agreements for the great powers. Empirically, the U.S. kicked out of TPP in order to put China at an economical disadvantage. In fact, the U.S. has done more than just kick out of agreements. We also see the U.S. sanctioning China and Russia, as S&P counts a number of times since 2022 where the U.S. has placed heavy sanctions on China. However, these mechanisms disproportionately affect marginalized communities. Oregon 22 explains that sanctions increase the poverty gap and impact the poorest the hardest. And the cost of recovery after is near crippling because it obstructs access to important resources and humanitarian aid for civilians. The impact is poverty. GSRD 17 laments that sanctions lead to a 25.5% decline in GDP per capita, and Numerous 16 tells you that U.S. sanctions have uniquely exacerbated the poverty gap by 3.8%. The second area of conflict is tariffs. York 22 finds the U.S. is currently imposing a 25% tariff on approximately $250 billion of imports from China. And CRS 22 continues that after the first imposition of tariffs, China responded by imposing an additional $60 billion on U.S. goods. Just 5 days ago, Jane tells you that China and the U.S. are both in a massive trade war brimming with tariffs that are caused and received both ways. In fact, Rose 20 reports that based on 5 decades of data, tariffs are directly correlated with severe economic decline because it raises the price of goods. Because both countries are placed in a bind, able to respond, tariffs weaken relations and affect both countries economically. The impact is a global manufacturing fiasco. With supply chains already in shambles due to the recent pandemic, Bone 22 tells you since the massive China-US tariffs that caused a trade war have weakened key sectors in the manufacturing industry, such as semiconductors. Robinson 22 finds semiconductor imports to China dropped by 12.4%, and Alira laments a drop in manufacturing directly increases the risk of a global recession, which is why Ayano 20 finds the U.S. semiconductor industry fears a tech cold war could disrupt the global supply chain. Shafee 22 quantifies that domestic chip shortage will cost the market $210 billion. Youngstown tells you empirically between January and April, manufacturing employment dropped by 5 million jobs. Thus, we urge a negative ballot.
Time starts now. We affirm our strategy in the GPC became official as of 2017, so we must consider time only after 2017. Also, the great power competition forces us to look at a timescope with more than one great power competing for hegemonic power. With that out of the way, contention 1 is foreign aid. Foreign aid is a core part of U.S. great power competition. It promotes economic and security goals while preventing detrimental influence. Savoy 22 finds that competition spurs reliance on foreign aid. The U.S. supported allies address humanitarian concerns and enforce beneficial policies through foreign aid. The impact is billions of lives. U.S. leadership in aid is a game changer that is solving global poverty, as FPA 22 finds that the U.S. leadership on poverty has contributed to a dramatic decrease in global extreme poverty from 36.3% of the world's population to just 8.6%. The U.S. invests in a multitude of poorer countries globally, providing a stepping stone to lifting them out of poverty. This has also saved billions from starvation and millions from tropical diseases. The U.S. is key, as Yoho 20 explains that the U.S. Global Hunger Initiative has helped to lift more than 23 million out of poverty, prevented 3 million children from being stunted, and ensured that 5 million families are no longer suffering from hunger. Contention 2 is nuclear proliferation. The U.S.'s strategy in the GPC of a nuclear umbrella is what's holding the entire world together. U.S. allies trust the American nuclear umbrella, and the nuclear umbrella is vital to alliance reassurance and for maintaining strong relationships, because the United States ensures their security against nuclear attack and intimidation and removes any perceived need on their part to acquire nuclear capability. However, without the U.S. nuclear umbrella, other countries would then proliferate. The impact is extinction. Proliferation is detrimental and would essentially lead to extinction, as Kroenig of Georgetown University elaborates that proliferation of nuclear weapons increases instability, as nations often proliferate snowballs. This is to say, when one nation attains nuclear weapons, it incentivizes surrounding nations to proliferate as well for security. Moreover, Thayer 18 of Chicago finds that rapidly nuclearizing states often cut corners, making inadvertent launches likely. Kroenig 15 writes that new nuclear states go through a transition period in which they lack second strike capabilities. This means that new nuclear states are more willing to use nukes because they have weaker military capabilities. This increases the probability of a nuclear exchange, as states will strike before new nuclear states develop second strike capabilities. That's why Star 15 writes, this could cause most, if not all, humans and animals to die from nuclear famine. To put it simply, nuclear proliferation will result in mass extinction. Contention 3, space-based solar panels. Space-based solar power, or SSP, can be defined as solar panels in space. Because they're continuously exposed to sunlight, they generate 40 times more energy than on Earth. This means not only is it way more efficient than any of our outdated strategies, but it doesn't even require land. Before the Great Power Competition, we did not develop SSP. However, GPC has propelled development. Garrison 20 states China hit on SSP power as an area of GPC, entailing a serious response from America, which spurred a race between China and the US to developing SSP. American progress has been fruitful, as Garrison 20 continues by stating, newly developed American technology, specifically a spaceplane, will demonstrate how to use satellites to generating the solar power, a turning point for SSP development. Jones 22 also finds that China is developing an SSP power station and plans to conduct a power transmission experiment in low Earth orbit in 2028. Ultimately, David 21 writes that the SSP roadmap promises operational satellites to scale within a decade. The impact. A shift is key, as Garrison 17 finds that the scale to meet all of humanity's energy needs, providing virtually unlimited green renewable power to an energy-hungry world is imperative. The worlds will fall in suite, as Goswami 22 says that great powers determine how other nations act. This is crucial, as Taylor 19 finds that pollution will kill an estimated of 150 million people or more for every degree of Celsius of warming, so essentially resulting in extinction. Therefore, we urge an affirmative ballot. Now you can have this question.
Okay, so when is the general bright line for your space solar panels argument?
We're just talking about how the SSP roadmap basically promises operational satellites to scale within a decade.
Mm-hmm. And by which specific governments? Is it going to be just the U.S. or is it going to be other powers that are investing in space solar panels?
We talk about how both the U.S. and China have an investment race right now, which is increasing technological advances.
Mm-hmm.
Answer your question.
Okay, you can have the next question.
Okay, cool. Your tagline. Can I get your taglines really quickly? If I have this right, you have 1 contention, 3 subpoints: military spending, economical disadvantage, and tariffs.
Kind of. We have 1 contention on military spending, another contention on econ warfare, and 2 subpoints under that: sanctions and tariffs.
Thank you. So,
can I have the next question then?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so on your second contention on nuke prolif, so you basically tell me that the U.S. umbrella is protecting all these allies. Why is U.S. hegemony necessary for the U.S. to retain its umbrella?
Because, U.S. hegemony is necessary because the U.S. being the only great nuke power means they hold the umbrella all over smaller countries. So the U.S. does have to be a hegemony to like hold an umbrella.
But the only thing they don't have is like they lack some sort of influence. But at the end of the day, they still have those nuclear capabilities. So are you basically trying to tell me that if we don't have U.S. hegemony, we take away certain nuclear capabilities, or is it that we decrease influence, which in turn leads us to makes our nuclear umbrella worse? Like, which is it?
We decrease influence, which decreases.
Why does influence decrease a country's nuclear capabilities?
Well, influence basically decreases. Did somebody say something? Okay, that's fine. It would decrease a country's nuclear capabilities due to the fact that a country needs to be a hegemonic power to stop other countries, smaller countries from proliferating. Because if Russia increases its hegemonic power, or if Ukraine increases its hegemonic power, it then threatens smaller countries that are under our nuclear umbrella, which results in them looking for proliferation.
But the nuclear umbrella isn't like an umbrella of influence. It's an umbrella of nuclear capabilities. As long as they retain those capabilities, they still get to defend their allies.
Yeah. We're not saying it's an umbrella of influence. We're just saying influence is a huge part, because when other powers gain influence, it then in a way scares other countries.
But they still have those nuclear capabilities, right?
Not only that, but like with no hegemony, basically the US doesn't have any credibility. So it's not like other countries would trust the US. So it's all just cause and effect.
Okay, thank you. That's Cross.
Mm-hmm.
A time we begin in 3, 2, 1. Start on their framework. We don't agree the GPC started in 2017. In fact, it started much earlier, such as the beginning of the 2000s or even the mid-19th century, 20th century, because that's when the U.S. was fully recognized as a global power, and that was when China and Russia started competing with the U.S. to form a great power competition. Then let's go on to the foreign aid. Couple responses here. First, foreign aid is bad because the U.S. typically aids other countries with high interest rates. These countries are dug deeper into a hole of debt. Empirically, you see this with literally any country the U.S. has aided. When the aid comes with high interest return, this means that these countries are more likely to turn to China or Russia because their aid doesn't come with interest, which has been empirically backed. This is why we still see areas like Africa's economy suffering. You always look towards us as solvency because at the very least in the Neg world, we give you some sort of solvency where the U.S. doesn't give aid with interest, whereas in their world, you still see the status quo. But then you can turn this a second time. Lyons 14 finds that foreign aid into other nations are just attempts for policymakers to achieve strategic objectives rather than prioritizing the well-being of the continent. More specifically, foreign aid is detrimental to developing nations in two key ways. The first is corruption. Aid only strengthens the corrupt government in developing countries, giving them more money, creating an unfair power play between the governments. Handing over the money to governments like these do not promote growth and prosperity, but help fund military equipment and dishonest transactions, exacerbating civil rights issues in these countries and plummeting quality of life further for civilians. The second is through dependence. Aid does not strengthen a country's long-term growth, but only increases a country's dependence on the developing nations providing assistance, thereby giving the developing nations leverage over who's receiving it. Developing nations have now become almost exclusively dependent on aid to sustain themselves, causing them not to prioritize national business because of the easy money they're getting. You're always going to look towards social solvency again because at the very least in the Neg world we don't see dependence or corruption, but in the Aff world you do. But then onto nuclear prolif. First, turn this crowing 15 rights of proliferation incentivizes first strikes to ensure superiority before new proliferating powers reach a state of mutually assured destruction. They go through a transition period in which they have no second strike capabilities. This is why nuclear proliferation is good. 3 warnings here. First, the state of nuclear superiority will strike before its advantage is lost. Second, the smaller, more vulnerable state lashes out in prediction of an attack. Because both sides have no second strike capabilities, striking first is the only way to survive. Thus, one state might strike first in the belief that striking first is better than striking second. You're going to weigh this on probability. It's far more likely that smaller, less economically secure countries will lash out in fear of their self-preservation, rather than for large and secure countries like the U.S. to rationally strike. Remember, mutually assured destruction doesn't apply because their countries don't have second strike capabilities, meaning the first striker survives and the second striker dies. Then you can not unique this. The U.S. nuclear umbrella is not the deciding factor as to when countries proliferate or not. Dabler 20 tells us the U.S. nuclear umbrella does not matter and is based more on other factors. This means that the U.S. umbrella crumbles, you'll still see other countries proliferate, but even then, the umbrella isn't an umbrella of influence. They never tell you why hegemony is vital to keep an umbrella umbrella. In either world, the U.S. retains their nuclear capabilities, and in either world, the U.S. still keeps the nuclear umbrella. It's never going to happen. But then specifically onto nuclear prolif, no country is going to go into nuclear war because their economy will collapse. ASIS 14 tells you that in today's economy is so much more economically interconnected since the last global war. Shipping becomes more expensive due to high insurance costs and riskier. The level of economic adaptation required to adapt to a world war will be crushing. But then on SSP, first of all, GreenMax finds that space solar panels don't work. These environments out in space also have several hazards that could cause damage to the solar panels. These include space debris and extreme solar radiation, which could degrade the solar panels up to 8 times faster than panels installed on Earth, which is why Murphy 12 continues that technologically space solar panels are not compatible with the environment. But then you can delink this because space-based solar power isn't even feasible. Murphy 12 follows that if the SSP is way too expensive, it costs $220,000 per kilogram of launch material. We have a history of hope and optimism that launch costs will plummet in the future. So far, this hasn't even really happened, and rising energy prices aren't even going to help drive costs even lower. Meanwhile, U.S. SSP programs appear to be scaling back. But secondly, Murphy discusses how it's practically impossible to transmit power from outer space to Earth, and any means developed to do so would be extremely inefficient. You're always going to look towards the neg.
All right, time will begin on my first story. Judge, let's go to our first contention about foreign aid. They say that that would prevent bad aid and there's high interest in return, so the countries will turn to China or Russia. Judge, this will only incentivize the U.S. to provide better aid to compete with China and Russia, so you can disregard this response. And then they talk about how it's detrimental to developing nations. However, in our case, we specifically tell you that the U.S. is already solving poverty and has prevented billions of lives from being lost, and it's helped 23 million people out of poverty, prevented 3 million people from being stunted, and 5 million families no longer suffer from hunger. So clearly, this isn't the case. Next, under our second contention, they talk about the U.S. is not a deciding factor, and how the U.S. umbrella doesn't matter. However, we tell you that the U.S.'s strategy in the great power competition is the nuclear umbrella, and without the great power competition, the U.S. wouldn't have the strategy of the nuclear umbrella. Next, they talk about how nuclear superiority and how the mutually assured destruction does not apply. We agree with this. This is a whole reason why I tell you that proliferation will lead to extinction, and they talk about how no country will go into nuclear war. Well, these two responses literally contradict each other, because one of them is talking about how nuclear proliferation will lead to war, and the other one is talking about how no country will go to nuclear war. These two responses contradict each other. You can't buy either of them. Onto our third contention about climate change, they talk about how SSP is unfeasible. However, we tell you that consultation published by the UK government in 2021 finds that space-based solar power is technically and economically feasible. And it's also recognized as a technological solution that can be put in practice 10 years before the 2050 net zero goal of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Additionally, based on an estimate that a full-size system will cost 16.3 billion euros to develop and launch, allowing for a minimum rate of return on investment of 20% year on year. It could generate energy at 50 euros per MWH. That's 39% to 49% cheaper than biomass nuclear or the most efficient gas energy sources. It's also estimated for costs to reduce as development proceeds. Additionally, it isn't impossible to transmit power, as wireless energy transmission has been advancing for decades. Next, Judge, let's go on to framework. We agree with what they said about framework. The Great Power Competition did say 1900s, but a current strategy began in 2017. The resolution is asking about a current strategy, so you must consider a time only after 2017. Next, let's move on to our opponent's case. On our first point about military spending, we tell you non-unique because the U.S. military spending has always been high. And even if you don't buy this, macro trends finds that while military spending has been increasing, the percent of our GDP being spent on military is decreasing. This is so you can see that regardless of GPC or not, the U.S. will always have this military spending. And we also turn this because military spending actually boosts the economy, as Jerry Gard 22 finds that China and the U.S.'s economy has grown since the start of the GDP. This is because GPC and incentivizes these countries to increase investment in many sectors so that they can be ahead of everyone else. This means that GPC actually boosts the economy rather than decreases it. On the second contention about economic warfare, specifically on sanctions, I tell you non-unique because you're going to see sanctions no matter which way you vote. Even before GPC, the U.S. was already sanctioning other countries. These impacts happened in both worlds. Next, on to terrorist and trade war, we tell you that the U.S. This is non-unique because the U.S. and China's trade war is already ending, as Bone 22 finds that nowadays China is selling U.S. more items than ever, and the U.S. has dramatically slowed the sanctions and tariffs on China. This means no matter what, the impacts are going to being solved right now. And even if you don't buy this, we tell you turn because trade wars are actually good because they move us to its economic independence from China in the long term. And even if there are some economic negative economic effects right now, in the long term we will benefit from not having to yield to China because of the economic bargaining chips. And so, Judge, we have successfully defend our frontline our case, and we respond to every single point in our opponent's case. So thus, we urge an affirmative ballot.
Let's turn 3, 2, 1. Okay, so you sent me like this David 21 card giving me the bright line for SSP, right? Yeah, do you mind like reading that sentence out loud where they like predict that SSP is gonna be like made in the next 10 years?
Sorry, give me a second.
Yeah, no problem.
So over the past decade, researchers have made impressive advances that increase the likelihood of space-based solar power will be realized during the next decade.
Okay, first of all, wait, two things. First of all, what does increase the likelihood mean? And second of all, what does realize mean? Like,
and sorry, and Mankin said that the economics of SSP concepts in the near term within the next decade have never been more viable.
yeah, but what does viable mean? Like, you keep telling me, oh, we're going to make SSP in the next 10 years. But all I'm getting is that the likelihood is going to increase. Like, it's going to be economically viable. Like, we're going to have, like, it's going to be realized by the next decade. What does that all mean? And you never tell me directly that we're going to have SSP in the next decade. So I need an exact bright line as to, like, I need a source. When
there's another sentence in here that says, I believe that you could have operational solar power satellites to scale within the next decade. And then the UK government also gives you a bright line. It can be put in practice 10 years before the 2050 net zero. So within like the next decade or so.
Okay, sure. Why don't you take a question?
All right, so can you explain your response to a second contention about nuclear proliferation? You talk about how mutually assured destruction doesn't apply, so that will increase the probability of nuclear war. But then you go on to say how no country will ever go into nuclear war. Can you explain this response?
Yeah, of course. So first of all, I turn your argument. I tell you that nuclear proliferation is actually good because it incentivizes smaller states to not actually proliferate. Now everybody has nuclear weapons, so nobody wants to attack each other with these nuclear weapons, right? Otherwise, basically everyone dies, as you argue. But then second of all,
you tell us that MAD doesn't apply.
When did I say that?
Rebuttal.
I don't think I said that. I think you're misunderstanding the argument. But then, okay, let me finish first. And then second of all, I tell you specifically on nuclear prolif that like no country is gonna go into nuclear war specifically, not onto like nuclear proliferation, but no country is gonna go into nuclear war because it would crush the economy. Which is why I'm telling you that even if countries proliferate, even if the US's nuclear umbrella crumbles, you're never going to see like this nuclear war impact happen because first of all, nuclear proliferation prevents actual like nuclear war triggering, and second of all, nuclear war just will never happen. That's time.
Extend our second contention on economic warfare. You extend our first subpoint on sanctions. We tell you that China and Russia are striving towards your economy, and the U.S. is sanctioning these countries heavily in order to gain dominance economically. However, these sanctions disproportionately affect lower income communities because it obstructs access to aid and humanitarian resources. The impacts of poverty. Numerous studies tell you this causes a 3.8% rise in poverty. They have a couple of responses here. First, they tell you that sanctions will happen either way you vote. No, this isn't true. Without a world without GPC, there's going to be no sanctions at all because countries don't have any incentive to impose these sanctions because they're not fighting for hegemony. But second, they tell you that trade war isn't going to happen. Our link is in trade wars. You can disregard this response. But they have a term where they tell you that trade war is good economically. Sure, it might be good economically, but at the expense of the poorest of communities. But next, you go on to our first contention, military spending response to the term when they tell you that we're going to boost our economy at the cost, again, of the poorest of communities. Don't disregard this response. But next, you go on to their case. The round is over when they forget to respond to our turn on foreign aid. We tell you that we tell you that foreign aid increases corruption and dependency because one, it funds and gives money to corrupt governments, but second, developing nations don't have to prioritize their own national economies because they're getting easy money. A couple weighing mechanisms here. First, even if they prove the impacts of foreign aid in these programs being good in the short term, if there's an unstable and corrupt government, there's no way these policies can be continued in the future. And in the case that the US is no longer able to provide them with aid, this country would collapse even worse with US aid. You can see this with high poverty rates, and whatever country the US invests in, we outweigh an irreversibility because of this. But second of all, you outweigh insolvency because the NEG will prevent corrupt governments from taking over and crippling developing countries. But next, on to nuke prolif. Again, we have another piece of offense on their nuke prolif when we tell you that nuclear proliferation is actually good. Chronic 15 tells you that proliferation incentivizes first strike to ensure superiority before nuke proliferating powers reach a state of mutually assured destruction. They go through a transition period where they have no second strike capabilities. In 3 ways, a conflict can thus escalate. A state with no nuclear superiority will strike before its advantage is lost. But second, a smaller, more vulnerable state lashes out in prediction of attack because no sides have no second strike capabilities. Striking first is the only way to survive in a nuclear war. But even so, the umbrella is an umbrella influence. They never tell you why hegemony is vital to keep an umbrella either world. The US retains its capabilities. But next, on SSP, we tell you that solar panels aren't simply feasible because you can't invest in the environment. It's technologically not able. But next, on to weighing prereq this argument because we can't do anything in front of global poverty chain because of our sanctions argument. You're always going to vote for us to vote for them because you never solve for new pro and invest in SSP. If the US is the strongest actor, we directly trigger their impact because US be weak in the world. But second, on probability, you're always going to vote for us on probability of GPC going on for decades. We have never been able to see SSSP developing. We'll give you empirical examples of sanctions being imposed in the status quo. But second, on time frame, our impacts always happen first before theirs. They give you no bright line as to when their solvency impacts happen. It's just really vague, a decade, but we tell you that sanctions are happening in the status quo. That is why this is a clear negative ballot.
Time starts now. Judge, as we begin the speech, we tell you that we win the basis of this round, just like we win the round. On our framework, we agree that we have been a player in GPC since the 20th century, but we are debating on our current strategy as of 2017. This means that the time frame we are looking at is from 2017 and beyond. This automatically minimizes all of their impacts because we actually see the US solving for almost everything they talk about in the status quo. Okay, on their case, our opponents collapsed on sanctions. On economic warfare, we stand by our response because it still responds to their attempt at our front line. First of all, we did non-unique this. Okay, you're always going to see sanctions no matter which way you go. Ignore what they said because we literally have empirics that prove that even before GPC, you will always see the US sanctioning other countries in order to keep them in check. GPC has no correlation with the sanctions you see in the status quo, so you're never going to look towards them because their impacts happen in both worlds. We also delink this, but even then their impacts are never going to happen. Paulson tells you that based on the US history of sanctioning for other countries, their impacts have never happened. You're always going to look to our side based on the empirics we give you, as even in the time of GPC, you don't see their impacts in place. Okay, on our case, Judge, we collapsed on nuclear proliferation and on SSP. We win both of these arguments and win both of our links into extinction. We already responded to what they had to say on nuclear proliferation. We already told you that US hegemonic power is crucial because without the US's strategy in GPC, then the US has no credibility and thus other countries will not trust the US. They also talk about how mutually assured destruction doesn't apply, and we agree that's one of our links into nuclear war. Chronic 15 writes that new nuclear states go through a transition period in which they lack second strike capabilities, which means they are more willing to use nukes. They are misunderstanding our argument. We agree with everything they said, but we're telling you that the reason countries are going to be proliferating is because the US will decrease hegemonic power, and countries will then proliferate, which leads to everything we just said and are linked into extinction. Next, onto our third contention, they just repeat that it's infeasible, but we tell you that it's feasible. We have a card saying this. A consultation published by the UK government in 2021 finds that SSP power is technically and economically feasible. Additionally, it's 39 to 49% cheaper than biomass, nuclear, or the most efficient gas energy sources. So to what they said about costs, that's incorrect. We've also seen tremendous progress as Garrettson 20 continues by stating that the newly developed American technology, specifically spaceplane, will demonstrate how to use satellites to generating this solar power, and we already tell you that countries are investing right now. Okay, weighing on impacts. Both of our links into extinction still stand strong. prioritize any risk of extinction for these two reasons. First, if everyone is dead, nothing can happen, so we literally short circuit all of their impacts and outweigh. Second, extinction is by far the largest impact. Not only is this 100% irreversible, because if everyone dies, literally no one can be brought back to life, but it also has an extremely huge magnitude since everyone would die and future generations will literally never be born. At that point, you can't even consider any of our impacts and we automatically win your ballot. Yeah, time starts now. You can have this question.
Oh, so let's resolve this like SSP conflict, shall we? So the card you cited is from UK, right? Kaylin sent me the card. It says, tantalizingly, it's reckoned that this technological solution could be put into practice 10 years before the 2050 net zero goal. When does it ever say it's going to be put into practice? All it says it could be put into practice. It might be put into practice. It's feasible. There's a chance. I need a card that tells me it's going to be put into practice. It's already in the U.S. legislation. Where is that?
Oh, because we in our case we tell you that that newly developed American technology can already demonstrate how to use satellites to generate solar power, and we tell you that China is developing a space-based solar power station and plans to conduct a power transition in low Earth orbit in 2028. We tell you all of this in our case, and we tell you that this is already happening in the status quo.
What does plans mean? You tell me like China plans to do this by 2028. Are they already doing it? Is it already in their legislation? Is America doing this too?
China is developing, and America has developed and will demonstrate how to use satellites.
What does demonstrate mean?
Will show.
So, okay, sure. You can take a cut.
But my only problem with your impact is, though, GPC has been going on since like 1949. There's been academic papers like written since that time, like since the beginning. However, how like why haven't we seen any of your developments for like the past?
Let's address two things first. First of all, we already tell you that why we're not looking at like the 1900s. We're looking from 2017 and beyond, because we're talking, this resolution is literally talking about our current strategy in GPC, and the Trump administration literally gave out a statement in 2017.
It never specifies in the resolution, never says we're going to evaluate modern day GPC, just saying GPC in general. That means that we can also evaluate past
resolution. It's talking about GPC strategy.
Where does it say? Where does it say we need to evaluate modern GPC?
Okay.
All right, so first, the wording of the resolution uses the word produces and not produced. And then second, we tell you that even if, we tell you that we, because of the great power competition, we tell you in 2020, China has started developing this space-based solar power, right? So then immediately, US responded and everything has been happening.
So you say 2017.
Here's the resolution. Result: the United States strategy of the great power competition produces more benefits than harms. We're talking about strategy, and our strategy came to be in 2017.
Okay, so let's say it was 2017. Even then, if you start developing in 2017, why haven't we seen any technological advancements yet?
Because we have newly developed.
Why haven't we seen any of your impacts in space? Why aren't we seeing any solar panels in space?
Because these
your
don't
timeline isn't definitive either. You just say, oh, a decade, maybe like around a decade, we might start implementing these solar panels.
We've already started investing. Both countries have already started investing, and we are looking to actually put. So we've already have the technology. At least the U.S. does, and China still invests. We're going to like actually put it into. I'm blanking right now, but we're actually going to use it within the next. We're actually.
So then if it's just investments, not even technological advancements at this point.
We have technological advancements.
Well, the U.S. has technological advancements, but China is investing right now. That's what's creating like an investment race in SSE.
China is developing space-based the solar stations. You can see happening right now, and just also these technological advancements don't happen overnight, but that's way over across.
Yeah. My time will begin in 3, 2, When it's game over for them, the nail has hit the coffin. You're going to start on our subpoint A on sanctions on economic warfare. You extend this when we tell you that right now China and Russia are going to the economic sector, and the U.S. is pulling out of many agreements, but also are sanctioning Russia and China as of right now, which disproportionately affects marginalized community, which is also why we see a 25.5% drop in GDP per capita and a 3.8% exacerbating in poverty. We impact out to global poverty and national poverty within the U.S. Now, they tell you a couple of responses they extend in summary. First, they tell you still see sanctions in either world. Two responses here. First, they don't give you any empirics as to whether we see sanctions before GPC. You don't let them bring it up further into this round. But second of all, that we already tell you there's no incentive for these countries to actually sanction other countries if there's no GPC. In our world, we still have sovereignty. In their world, they don't. But then they try to delink this and say that our impacts never happen. Two things. First of all, this is a new response in summary. Don't let them bring them up in final focus. But second of all, they don't even give you a warrable while we tell you that as of the status quo, poverty has been exacerbated by 3.8%. You're going to prefer us over them. Let's go over to some weighing. You're always going to prefer us over three weighing mechanisms. First, we outweigh on a prereq. We can't do anything if we're in a global poverty chain because of our sanctions. You're always going to have to vote for us to vote for them because you never sell for nuke prolif or SSP. If the U.S. is the strongest actor, then we directly trigger their impact because the U.S. will weaken their role. You always look towards us to sell for them. But then you vote on us on probability. You always have GPC going on for decades, but we have never seen SSP being developed. While we give you empirical examples of sanctions, they give you no bright line as to when their solvency impacts happen. But then you always prefer us on probability again because you always prefer probability over their extinction because the policymakers are always focused on big impacts like extinction. We would never get anything done, but additionally, big impacts with small amounts of probability would take focus away from impacts that are actually happening in the status quo, such as sanctions. But then let's go over to their case. The arguments that win us around is the unresponded turn on foreign aid. We tell you that first of all, corruption, aid dependency is going to make foreign aid bad for these countries. This is something unresponded to. Don't let them bring it up in final focus. But then we extend our prolif two responses. That first of all, the U.S. nuclear umbrella is not the deciding factor, and second of all, the umbrella isn't based on U.S. influence. You see it in either world. Again, these are clean conceded. Don't let them bring it up in final focus or let them respond to it. Lastly, on SSP, all they tell you is that's not feasible. First of all, they'll tell you it's feasible to build it. That doesn't predict that SSP is going to be built. But second of all, you don't even see their impacts materialize. They give you no bright line whatsoever. It's a clear vote for the neg.
All right, time starts now. Judge, we're collapsing on our second and third contention, so you can disregard all other responses. On our second contention about nuclear proliferation, we tell you that the reason why the U.S. has a nuclear umbrella is because of its strategy in the great power competition. And we have a clear link into extinction because we tell you that mutually assured destruction doesn't apply. On our third contention, they just keep on repeating that's infeasible, and they have no bright line. However, we literally tell you that it is feasible, that it can be put into practice within a decade. And we just keep in mind that these technological advancements aren't going to happen overnight. And we already see progress in the status quo. We see advances and developments happening in China and the U.S. Next, let's go on to our opponent's case. On economic warfare, we stand by our response because we tell you that you're going to see sanctions no matter which way you vote. And we literally tell you that even before GPC, the U.S. has been sanctioning other countries to keep them in check. And GPC has no correlation between sanctions and status quo. So you're never going to look towards them because their impacts happen in both worlds. Next, Judge, let's go on weight. First, we outweigh on prereq because if everyone is dead, nothing can happen. So we short take all their impacts. Judge, if you're dead, it doesn't matter if you're in poverty because you're dead. Nothing can happen. Always prefer lives. We also outweigh reversibility because lives can never be brought back, but people can be lifted out of poverty and they can be helped. But once somebody is dead, nothing can bring them back. Judge, you always have to vote for us off of reversibility. And no matter what has happened in this round, we link to extinction 2 times. And that is the one thing that truly matters in this round because as I said before, if everyone dies, nothing can happen. So we short circuit all their responses. And second, extinction is by far the largest impact. And not only is it 100% irreversible, it also has an extremely huge magnitude. So at this point, probability shouldn't even matter. As Bostrom 11 explains, that the expected value of reducing existential risk by a mere 1/1000th of a percentage point is worth 100 billion times as much as 1 billion human lives. Remember that a percentage of infinity is still infinity. So even if we have a slightly lower probability, it is not worth taking even the smallest risk when you're handling the lives of an infinite amount of people. Judge, you'll always have to prefer our links into extinction. So Judge, we cleanly win this round, and the impacts also have an hour word. So thus we urge an affirmative ballot.
Well, congrats to both teams for making it to finals. Potomac GPC, as was said in the chat, and yeah.
Thank you. Great round, everyone.
Great round.
So
No, no,
good.
I forgot to say the nail has hit the coffin really, really, really hard.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.